Ever written a chord progression that works but just feels lifeless? Today I'm revealing the secret to crafting chords with real emotion, the kind that actually moves the listener. I studied classical music at the Sydney Conservatorium, and my harmony lecturer was obsessed with rules. And honestly, at first they felt really restrictive, but when I started applying these rules in pop and electronic music, they were actually game changers, helping me write better chord progressions and songs. And it seems small, but zeroing in on these techniques is what helped me sign my first publishing deal, sign tracks to major labels, and even score placements on shows like The Voice and Australian Idol. So I'm going to break down the theory behind these chord progressions and how to use them to create powerful, emotionally driven tracks. So let's dive in. Okay, so the first thing that we want to note is that the majority of modern pop songs are going to have a maximum of 4, maybe 5 chords if there's a passing tone or a bridge throughout the whole song. So we want to be really focusing on the order of those 4 chords, how we voice them, and all different techniques that I'm going to show you throughout this video. So one thing that's going to be very helpful throughout your writing journey, music career, is learning Roman numerals and learning the sort of Roman numeral system for chords. And once you learn this, you'll begin to see the similarities between pop songs. You'll start to see certain patterns emerge, and you'll be able to craft your own progressions with freedom. So if we have a look at this, we're going to focus on C major for today. So if you've got a major scale, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, every note of that major scale is assigned a chord, essentially. So that's how we want to look at it. Basically, we want to use these Roman numerals. So you'll see for the minor chords, we've got a lowercase Roman numeral and then an uppercase for the major chords. So you could almost put any combination of chords together using this formula and it'll sound decent. It doesn't mean that it'll be great or you'll be able to write an awesome song over it, because there are so many moving parts that kind of make a great song. But if you have a look at this just for a very basic foundation, this is going to make a big difference in how you hear music and how you write it. So you've got major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, and then diminished, which you don't really have to worry about so much at the moment. It's usually just used as kind of a passing chord or, maybe in a bridge or just for some kind of tension. Now you then have the relative minor. So all of the same notes are in this scale, but if we go from C, we go up 6, and that's in any major scale, you go up 6 and you'll have the relative minor. So if we have a look here, it basically starts from where the minor chord started, which is here, and it's the same combination of minor, diminished, and major chords. So we've got major, diminished, major, minor, minor, major, major. So this thing's a little bit boring right now, but once we put it into practice, it'll all make sense. So the key thing to remember here is this formula as best you can, even if you just learn it in the major scale for now. And then we're going to make these chords more interesting, because of course there's nothing worse than basic block chords just played in sequence, because you really want to make sure that you're making these chord progressions interesting, you're adding feeling to them as well. So this is just a very quick foundation for anyone who's sort of confused by the Roman numeral system or just sort of creating chord progressions in general. So let's have a look at some of these chord progressions in action, and we're going to use some pretty well-known pop tracks just to really kind of identify the patterns and just sort of see what's going on under the hood here. So if we have a look at a chord progression like this, we're in a minor key and we're starting on chord 6. So another thing to note, you don't always have to start on the tonic. It can be really nice and sort of add some tension, add sort of a dreamier element to the chord progression if you start on something like chord 6. So let's give it a go. So using only 3 chords from the minor scale, let's just quickly flick back and have a look. We're using 6, 7, and 1, and then going back to 7. So really, really simple here. And also don't forget, it's about the rhythm that's making this interesting. And in case you didn't pick it up already, that is Closer by Chainsmokers. I'm sure most of you did. And if you listen to the melody underneath it, so in a funny way, it resolves on chord 6 and ascends to chord A. So there's a lot of tension there. And with this particular chord progression, you can build that tension in so many different ways. In fact, if you have a look at the next track here, we've got Stay by Kid Laroi and Justin Bieber. So same chord progression, different application. The only difference here is that we've added a passing chord, chord 5, which connects really nicely back to chord 6 because they're only a semitone away. So little things like that you can do to change these chord progressions up. And it's a really good thing to do as well, just to reference other chord progressions, see what you can do differently, see what chords you can add. And now that you've got sort of the Roman numeral system, you'll know exactly where those chords are and what the possibilities are. Before we start sort of dressing these chords up and really making them as interesting as possible, these are some more examples. probably one of the most popular pop chord progressions there are, starting on the A and going to 6. That's such a nice feeling, and I think people just tend to really connect with it. I remember John Mayer saying that in a big talk he did like years ago. He said for some reason people just connect with that movement. Then we've got the resolution to the major third here, which just kind of opens it up really nicely, and then more tension on chord 7 before we resolve it back to 1. So a really good example of this, see if you recognize this one. Okay, so the chord progression is exactly the same on the second half, but what have they done differently here? They've added that chord 4 at the very end because it just switches it up a little bit. And if you look again just at the Roman numeral system, we're in a minor key here. If you want to go to chord 4 of the scale, so if you want to go to D, you know that it's going to be minor because of course it's in the lower case. And that song is Takeaway by Elenium and Chainsmokers. Don't forget that you can screenshot these. I've written the Roman numerals in red above the chords. So moving on, this is the newer song and we're going to look at something in more of a major progression. Check this one out. So if you've heard that one recently, that's Ed Sheeran's Sapphire. This uses a very, very common chord progression, but with a slight twist. So that second chord, instead of going to chord 5, where it would typically go, and you've heard that progression a million times, I'm certain. If you play that on your keyboard right now with chord 5, a G there instead of a D minor, you'll absolutely notice it. Just to show you really quick, this is the chord progression that I'm thinking of originally. So yeah, it's a super, probably tried and true progression, I'll say, but it does work. If you've ever got a pop song or even something that is a little more indie, but you really kind of want to bring those feels out, it's a reliable one and you can really put your own spin on it with the techniques that we're going to talk about. So that's a really good example of a major key. Now, all of these progressions we've looked at up to this point have been very by the book. They're sort of leading with the third on top the majority of the time, bass notes at the bottom, all of the middle notes stacked up, 1, 3, 5, repeated, whatever it is. Of course, that does work and there's a time and a place for that, but sometimes you really want to start to get that emotion out of these chord progressions, and they might sound really ordinary when you play them for the first time, but after you kind of make some of these changes I'm about to show you right now, you'll notice that it almost sounds like a completely different chord progressions. Let's check this next one out. It's the same chord progression, and you'll probably recognize the song that I'm sort of imitating here. Okay, so what is the difference between these two? We're actually using on this second progression, which is basically imitating Lose You to Love Me by Selena Gomez. The first thing that we're looking at are inversions. So how can you swap these notes around to make the chords more interesting and more cohesive? When you start using inversions, you'll see less leaps like this, going, down a third or so in the top line, and you'll see something a lot smoother like this. That can honestly be the difference between a professional sounding chordal section in your production as opposed to something that's a little clunkier and just kind of all over the place. Oftentimes, if you try and stack up your chords like I've kind of done here, sort of using Cthulhu to lay these down initially, but if you're using every single note every single time, it's actually going to create less space in your mix and honestly less headroom. It can confuse the listener as well. So of course, this is dependent on your purpose, what you're really going for. If you're doing, an Adele sort of piano track, maybe it's a little bit different, but I'm talking about sort of fuller, maybe pop productions. You want to kind of be a little more strategic with how you're using your pads and your voicing. If we just flip over to something like this chord here, this is a basic C chord. So if we want to look at inversions and how they work, this is the first chord from the Ed Sheeran and Selena Gomez track. If we have a look at the bottom note, if we wanted to make a first inversion chord, you don't have to remember all of this, but this can be really helpful just so you know what you're looking at. If that's your first chord, if you flip that to the top, you've then got a first inversion chord. So that is where your root flips up to the very top of the chord, just an octave above, and now the third is the root of the chord. So that means it's first inversion. Now, if you flip the next one to the very top, that's second inversion. So they're your three types of inversions. You've got just root position, which is 1, 3, 5. Then you've got 3, 5, 1, and then 5, 1, 3. Again, you don't have to necessarily memorize that or even fully understand it right now. But all I want to stress is that these basic root position chords don't have to stay like that. You can actually invert them to make the voicing a little more interesting or just a little bit smoother. So if we have a look at the Lose You to Love Me example, All we've done is kept the first and fifth of just about every chord, and we've kept one note more or less constant, and that's C. That can be a really great note just to sort of keep pedaling across the top of the progression. So pedal tones can be fantastic for this, and you'll often find them when you start to invert your chords as well. So if you sort of find that there are chord progressions where you're seeing these gigantic leaps and, you've maybe downloaded a MIDI hack or something like that, if you swap these notes around, look for these similarities, look for where the voices are really close. Maybe you want them in sort of the upper register, or maybe there are massive leaps and sort of just notes that you don't really need. All I'm doing here is keeping the root and fifth along with the first. That can be a really nice way to sort of help these chords just sit in the mix better, but also have that little bit more feeling. So the key takeaway for this is that smoother voice leading, keeping some of those voices in the top register a little closer together, can be that kind of emotional glue for your track. So if we look at something like Justin Bieber's Sorry, this chord progression here. So we've got the same note in the top, so it's the minor third, and the fifth on the first chord. And then it ends, nice resolution, with the third on the top. Now, maybe you don't want that note to change, and it doesn't have to. So what we can do is actually create what's called a suspension. So from the bass note of this chord, it's an 11th away. So you can essentially leave out the third and put that extension there. So now we play the progression and the note stays the same throughout the whole progression. And so like the Selena Gomez track, we're using C, the tonic. Again, that's another pattern. Whatever the relative major is, using that tonic across the top of the chord progression can be really nice. And so that creates this kind of suspense. It's not resolving to the third, but when it does, if you do something like this, so, you may not want that type of thing to happen, but that's a really good example of how you can actually resolve a suspension, because technically they're meant to be resolved. So they're meant to be set up by the chord before it, which is really, really important, because sometimes just putting a suspension out of nowhere can sound a little bit funny. But again, that was another one of the rules of my lecturer. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to follow it. You can definitely break that, but you'll have an easier time with your voice leading if you kind of set them up first. So the minor third in this chord, for example, sets you up for the suspended fourth or 11th in that next chord. So using the sort of prior chord to set up extensions can be a really, really great way to create that feeling. And you can resolve them if you want, or you can just leave the suspense there. That's totally fine either way, because it's your song. So something that we've more or less already covered, but I think is really, really useful, are simply pedal tones. And you don't have to think about these too much, but if you just give yourself a really simple guideline that the first or the fifth can be really nice as a pedal tone over almost any chord progression, and you can try that out. First, second, fifth, they all work great. I've even used all of them together and, gotten a pretty cool result. So use that as a guide. The first or fifth can be used as a pedal tone. So if we have a look at this progression, Lose You to Love Me. So we're in C, C major. And we've got the fifth just riding across the top. It's not doing anything. This is one of the best ways to draw emotion out of almost any chord progression. So using the fifth, it works really nice. I'm just going to pump up the volume a little bit. So it's created this kind of ethereal sort of almost tension that just sort of rides across the top of that progression. Really, really cool. But if you want something more focused, you might go to the one. And this is what that sounds like. So it's a little bit more, the only word I can think of is maybe triumphant. It's just got more of that kind of down the line focus to it. So the fifth sort of takes you out a little bit, but again, it can be a vibe, like depending on your melody, depending on sort of atmosphere that you want to create. That's another really cool note that you can use. So 1, 2, and 5 for drones, for sort of ambient pedal tones can be great, not only within your chord progressions and the chord structures, but also on pads, external synths, and things like that. So the next thing I want to show you is a fairly similar principle to sort of adding those drones and pedal tones over your chord progression. But what we're going to look at here are what I like to call spice notes. So they're basically notes that spice up just about any chord progression, any kind of bass line, even without the chords. It just kind of adds something. And you'll find yourself using some combination of what I've found to be 7, 1, 5, 9, and 11. So if you think of those notes, learn where they are maybe on your primary instrument, or just map them out on the MIDI roll. Essentially, you want to go from your tonic major. So even if you're in a minor chord, look at the relative major and go from the tonic tonic of there, you want to look at 7, 1, 2, 5, 9, and 11. Seems like it's almost all the notes, but these are the special types of notes I feel that work really nicely together. So you can segment them. So 7, 1, 5 works really nice. So if you've got a basic progression, you'd have this maybe. And maybe you just want to add something like a pluck or even part of your vocal melodies this kind of works really well for. But let's just say for something like a little piano melody on the side, again, this is nothing special, but just to show you the example. So this is using 1, 2, and 5. It gives it some kind of extra feeling, be more creative with that. Maybe a different chord progression would be really cool. Just something that you can maybe use just to spice up your progressions. So this one's 7, 1, and 5. Again, super simple, but you never know when you might find yourself needing notes like this. I find that in little vocal chops and things, just knowing that, okay, the ones that are going to work, 1, 2, 7, 5, 9, 11, counting up the scale, I'm like, okay, yeah, I could probably use some kind of combination of those, keeping them sort of fairly close in their voice leading, not sort of jumping from 1 to kind of 11 necessarily, unless it calls for it. So this is using just 1 and 7. Now, what you might find if you're adding something like this, a lot of those top notes are going to get in the way. So let's take some of these out. You don't have to be too careful with it, but try and get just the one sort of harmonic line if you can. And you know what? I might even take out everything but kind of those lower bass notes. I might miss a few for now, but this is what it kind of can do with just those special spice notes alone. So it's still, for some reason, it's just able to kind of fill that space. Of course, I got some chords playing on pads underneath that, but even then, they're not prominent enough necessarily to inform every chord. So it gives you that sort of sense of space and just sort of real atmosphere that you might be looking for in your tracks. It's just a matter of taking out sort of the bulk of your block chords and using something a little different, almost like a melody to inform the chords, but not necessarily imply what every chord is. So same with that other one that we just played. I'll show you the two in a row. So I think that, if you were to play around with any other kind of combination of notes, maybe you wouldn't kind of get that same feeling, I don't think. But if you really want those kind of feelsy type notes, and of course, you'll do a much better job than what's here with your creations. So really try and build something out and use these combinations to your advantage. Use these little sort of systematic techniques and rules in harmony to make your track stand out. Again, if you know the rules, it's easier to break them, because if you know exactly the rule that you're breaking, you can just be more creative and have that freedom to do what you want with it. Thanks for watching, and if you want me to personally coach you to take your productions and mixes to a professional level, hit the link below and book a free discovery call. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.